Hi guys. So as promised, I'm making a video going over the DBQ requirements and expectations, as well as noting any changes that have been made for the new 2020 exam in light of all the recent events. So basically, I'm going to show you an adapted version of the PowerPoint I showed you in the beginning of the year about mastering the DBQ. It's the same one on Canvas. However, I've updated it with the new changes, as well as added examples of all the different skills. You guys can use that. Taking special note to the skills that you guys said you're most concerned about in the survey I sent out. And then I have some tips to give you guys about how to plan out your essay in the 10 minutes that you're given on the actual exam, because you have 45 minutes total. It's no longer 60, it's 45, with the first 10 minutes supposed to be for planning and the next 35 for writing. So I have some tips for those first 10 minutes and how to organize your thoughts, and even a document that I created that you guys could use that the day of if you feel like it helps you get yourself organized and ready to write your essay. So that I'll show you that as well. So this is the fourth time I've been trying to make this video. My computer doesn't like me, so now I'm using my husband's kind of 3-monitor setup right now at our house. So I'm gonna try to screen share with you guys, and we'll see how this works. Okay, so mastering the DBQ. All right, so no longer is the DBQ rubric out of 7 points. It's now been elongated to it being out of 10 points. So contextualization is still 1 point, thesis is still 1 point, evidence is now out of 3 points. I'll explain later why that is. Outside evidence is now out of 2 points instead of 1. I'll explain why that is. Extended analysis, or HIP, is still out of 2 points. And argument development is still 1 point overall. So I'm gonna go into each of these skills and what that looks like. So first steps when you see the prompt is to figure out what the question is asking. So you need to know any constraints, whether it's a time, if they give you some bookend years or dates, or if they say a certain era, like Jacksonian democracy. You have to know exactly kind of the general timeline of when that is. And then if it says certain places, like the DBQ said, like New England versus Chesapeake, you have to know both those places. And then if it says, like, you know, talk about politics and economics in the prompt, then you have to talk about both. You can't just talk about one. Then you have to try to figure out what skill they're looking for. Again, the 3 that I'll go over later in this video are continuity and change over time, compare and contrast, and cause and effect. So after you kind of figure out, you break down the prompt, know any constraints, figure out the skill and like what it's asking, then you go through and read all the docs before you write your thesis, because you might have an idea of what you might already argue looking at the prompt, but if the docs don't really gear towards what you're saying, that's gonna be hard to like shoehorn the documents into your argument. So best look over the documents first. Once you look over the documents, then go back and write your thesis and your contextualization, and then the rest of your paper. And you can organize your documents ahead of time into which paragraph you're gonna put them in. So the document I created will help you with that too. So I'll show you that later. All right, so point 1 is contextualization. So this is your intro paragraph. So this is the 3 to 4, it's minimum 3 to 4. I think that 4 or 5 is more safe. Sentences before the thesis statement. So you need to have 1 sentence minimum describing the time period just before the prompt with relevant info in the first sentence. So this is the first sentence of your paper. It should not be vague. It should have like CST and be describing the time period just before. And then the next 3+ sentences are describing the time period of the prompt. So the goal here is, if I were to be handing this essay off to someone like your parents who have not had history since like the 1980s, what do they need to know about this topic in order to understand the rest of the essay? If I was just to plop this person randomly into history, what do they need to know about what else is happening in the US or the world that's relevant that could impact what I'm about to say in this essay? The biggest problem here is that you cannot double dip. If it is something that you're going to call out specifically in your essay as evidence, if they see it through in one of the body paragraphs, they will go back to your intro and cross it out. So for instance, in the essay that you guys wrote about continuity and change in like campaigns and elections in like the Jacksonian democracy era and in first semester, a lot of people brought up expanding universal male suffrage in the intro, but then you mentioned it throughout your body paragraphs, like that was evidence and things that you were citing. that means the evaluator would have gone back up to your contextualization and crossed it out. So this is not stuff you'll be covering necessarily in your paper. But this is also not just fun facts either. No one should be kind of wondering like, why are they talking about Native Americans in an essay about, I don't know, World War One? So here's an example that does not include the thesis. So this is all the buildup. So the red is the before, so kind of big meaty sentence, and then a few more meaty sentences of the during, which is the blue. So the prompt was evaluate the extent of change in the domestic U.S. during the Second World War from 1939 to 1945. It's giving me the bookend dates of the during. So basically anything before 1939, like just before that, is fair game. So just before that, what's relevant? What is the U.S. doing in those years? And so even though I'm saying that the Second World War was brewing in Europe as Hitler continued to seize surrounding land and violate the Treaty of Versailles, the U.S. continued to remain isolationist. That's what the U.S. was doing. And then the during, 39 to 45. The U.S. wanted to continue its isolationist policies or tendencies in order to focus on its own issues, such as the burgeoning Great Depression, maintaining new lands gained via imperialism, as well as continuing progressive era reforms. The U.S. showed it had no desire to be, quote, the world's policeman, as it had not made any formal alliances or joined the League of Nations after World War I. However, all that changed when the U.S. became personally affected economically and socially by the increasing tensions abroad. So that kind of maybe still teeters a little bit on the before, but these are still things that were happening during, so that's still fine. But again, you can see I threw a lot of CST in there, and this is not stuff that I'll necessarily be discussing the body paragraph. Some things are hinted at, like, and that's totally fine. In the contextualization right here, I hint that the U.S. became affected by the war abroad financially and stuff. That's fine. If it's more vague up here, then you go into more detail in the body paragraph. That's fine. Just don't bring up your specific evidence you're going to use in the paragraph in the contextualization. Then your thesis. So the how you get the point for the thesis is it needs to address all parts of the question. Don't just like copy and paste all the phrases in the prompt, but use keywords. If it says, you know, robber barons are captains of industry, I would just parrot those words. It needs to take a stand. It can't be wishy-washy. We'll look at some examples in a second. And it has to have that complexity. The whole paper mirrors your thesis. So the thesis, 3 subtopics, you mirror the 3 subtopics for your body paragraphs, and it mirrors the same complexity. Like the counter argument is in your thesis, which is also your first body paragraph. And if you follow my formula, I guarantee you'll get the point. So this is my handy dandy formula. Although insert counter argument with its 1 subtopic, comma, main argument because blah, blah, 2 subtopics. So let's get some examples. So this is how you get the complexity. The evaluators know that nothing in history is black or white, and they want you to acknowledge that too. That's way more difficult to acknowledge that not everything is 100%. So if I was to answer the question, which is the best show, Game of Thrones or The Office, I can't be 100% on one side or the other. I got to acknowledge that somewhere in between, I would feel like this show maybe is a little bit better than the other, but I got to acknowledge that the other show is great too. So in bold right here, I have my formula, and down here is my example. Although Game of Thrones has spectacular visual effects, that's my counter argument, you know, that show is also good. The Office is the superior show, so I'm taking a stand, for its clever comedy and perfectly timed editing. Very specific reasons. You can clearly tell which way I'm leaning. I'm not vague, I'm taking a stance, and I acknowledge the other side. So here's a history example. If the prompt was, to what extent was the Civil War a revolution in American society? So this is a bad thesis. It doesn't have a counter argument, and its subtopics are very vague. There's a lot of different things that could be discussed when talking about politics or social stuff or the Constitution. So here is a good, effective thesis to that prompt. Although the Civil War was ultimately resulted in the reunification of the Union, meaning this didn't really change. Because the prompt is asking, like, was it a revolution? Did things change a lot, or did they really stay the same? So once you decide where you are on that spectrum, like, yes, I'm going to say it's a revolution. More things changed. I got to acknowledge one way that it stayed the same. Although the Civil War ultimately resulted in the reunification of the Union for the same country, the Civil War was a revolution due to the major cultural shift in the entire country and the changing interpretations of civil rights. So clear specific subtopics. I took a stance on it was more of a revolution, more things changed, but I did recognize one way that things stayed the same. Evidence. So this is the first change that I'm going to note. Before, you guys had 6 documents and you had to use at least 5 properly. Now you're going to be given 5 documents. 1 is guaranteed to be a visual, and you only need to use 4 documents effectively. I would still highly, highly recommend that you try to use all 5. Even if you bomb the 5th one, whichever one it is, it does not count against you to do it wrong. As long as you get 4 documents correctly used, you're good, you're golden, you got the point. So how do you get the point for using that document? You need to cite, explain, analyze. Cite, explain, analyze each doc. So no quotes, no quotes. They will cross off your quote. You will not get points for any documents, and you've already lost the points for the essay. They want to vomit when they see quotes, so you can never, ever quote. So you cite by referencing the document by name, explain the main idea, and then analyze it, meaning how does this prove my thesis is correct? So let's look at some examples. So I color-coded it here. The cite is in red, the explain is in blue, analyze is in green. So in Thomas Paine's Common Sense, right, he argues that it is unjust for the colonies to adhere to an authority overseas that they do not identify with. So a specific main idea, all in one sentence, cite and explain. And then again, I recommend that you put Doc 2 or Doc C or whatever they're using to identify that document as well at the end in parentheses. Because again, you do not know if you're like the 50th essay that evaluator is reading that day. So anything that you can do to make their job easier, overall, they will be more merciful with your paper. It just gives them a better impression, just psychologically, so please do it. And then the very next sentence should be, how does this prove my thesis correct? So this supports the idea, or my argument, or whatever, that the revolution was about political representation rather than economic independence, because he advocates for their own government, not to cut off economic ties with Great Britain. Whatever. This is kind of just like a made-up thing for a prompt that you can't see, but you get the idea. Cite, explain, and then the very next sentence is analyze. It doesn't just have to be 2 sentences, it can be more, but it can be done in just 2 sentences as long as those sentences are clear and specific. Okay, and then you're doing this on 4, hopefully 5 documents each. Outside evidence, this is also changed. Whereas before you needed to have only 1 specific piece of outside information somewhere in the essay, 3 body paragraphs, now you need 2. So this is not regarding the contextualization, the intro, this is in your 3 body paragraphs. Now you need to have 2 specific pieces of evidence or outside information. So again, this is something that you would not know by looking at the documents. It's totally separate from the documents, but it helps you prove that your thesis is correct, and it usually includes vocab terms. So to clarify, it could be something that's alluded to in a document, like for instance, the LAQ that you guys wrote about robber barons and captains of industry, last year we gave that to students as a DBQ. And in one of the documents, it talked about working conditions and how they were so bad, blah, blah, blah. And so workers try to fight back. But their outside evidence, they talked about the homestead strike. That's fine, because nowhere in the documents did it talk about the homestead strike. So that's different enough. So if it's kind of alluded to in the document, that's okay. But if you are expanding upon, if it even mentions the homestead strike, you're done. That's not outside evidence. But it'd be helpful if you explained it in the essay, but it can't count for outside evidence. If you were to explain it, you might accidentally even be doing a version of HIP. So you need to do this somewhere twice in some of the 3 body paragraphs. It doesn't even matter if it's in the same body paragraph. It just needs to happen twice in your 3 body paragraphs. And then HIP, the HIP that everyone loves. So because there's less documents, you need to do it on 2 documents now out of the 4 that you need to use. Again, just like I recommend using 5 documents in case you miss the mark on one, I recommend you do HIP on 3 documents just in case you miss the mark on one. Again, it won't count against you if you bomb one. It just helps you if you miss the mark. You can still get that point for doing at least 2. So it needs to be on two different documents. It doesn't matter if you're in the same body paragraph or not, and it does not matter which type of HIP you use, as long as you feel that it is helping your paper, it's relevant, and it's useful. So this is 1 to 2 sentences. that is in addition to after you cite, explain, and analyze your document. So this would be the very next sentence after that. So it's kind of like a big meaty analysis. So to go over those 4 kinds, historical context and purpose are probably the 2 most commonly used ones. Historical context, I think, is the easiest, most straightforward. So that's basically what in the world or country is happening that led to this doc being created or would impact this doc. You guys tend to naturally do this before even talking about the document anyway, and that's fine. If you write about the before you cite and explain and analyze the doc, that's fine. It doesn't matter where if it's before or after the document. Intended audience, who specifically was this written for, and how do we know this? This one is a little bit less used because it's a little less impactful. You just want to make sure you're being specific. Like if you're saying, like this was intended for the American public, like this speech was, it's like, okay, well, did that really help your paper? So you just want to make sure that the intended audience is something that is something that someone would not necessarily be able to infer without having all of your background knowledge. The next one is purpose. That's probably the second most used one. But people tend to get this one incorrect half the time. And I'll explain why so you don't make this mistake. So this is, why was the document itself created? So this trip up that people make is referring to the topic within the document, but not the document itself. So for example, if I gave a document from a senator who's discussing, like it's a speech or something, and he's discussing the Monroe Doctrine about how he really supports it or whatever it is, I've had students where they write the purpose of the Monroe Doctrine was blah, blah, blah. That's not what they want. It's not the purpose of something that's mentioned in the document. It's the document itself that was given to you. The document of the speech, the senator who says that he's supporting it. Why is he actually giving this speech to support it? Because maybe, I don't know, maybe you guys have some background information that this guy's actually making this speech because he wants, you know, Congress to increase funding for the Navy to enforce Monroe Doctrine, whatever it is. I'm making up examples off the top of my head. But you're taking a step back for the document itself, not just the purpose of a topic that was mentioned within the document. The other thing that some people might do with purpose is not digging deep enough. So I've heard some people in their essays write, the purpose of the speech was to inform the people about the war. Okay, that's probably like a more obvious or like a purpose. So dig deeper. Why would they even bother doing that? So digging deeper was, you know, the president, you know, FDR is trying to inform people about the war because he wants them to buy war bonds. That's the true purpose right there. That's digging a little bit more deep. So just asking yourself, if you're more of if it's more surface level, or if you're really getting to the deeper purpose there. The last one, point of view, is probably the most missed hip. And it's because point of view is a confusing term where we tend to use point of view in our everyday life as, this is my perspective, this is what I believe. But point of view does not mean that to the College Board. Point of view to them means bias. And I mean, it makes sense. Why would they want you to say their argument again? Because you just did that in the cite, explain, and analyze. You just did that in the explain, why, identifying their main idea, their main argument. So the point of view is taking a step back and looking at the author. So again, you're only going to do this if it's from someone noteworthy that you know, not some random person. But if it's like Abe Lincoln or something like that, you're like, okay, yeah, I know a little bit more about its background. And how could that play a factor into what he's about to say? So this is knowing this person or whatever information they give you in the source. Are they a certain race, gender, class, background, position, country, political party, something that would color how they feel about this issue? And again, only when you feel like it would add an extra punch to your essay. So like, I don't know, it's talking about a Southern Democrat senator who's talking about how slavery would be, or slavery is justified in the Bible or something like that. And you're like, well, yeah, he's a Southerner. His whole economic life depends on slavery. So of course he's going to be biased and try to justify slavery any means necessary. Boom. Like, you're calling him out on the bias. So again, not argument, but taking a step back at that person and what about them could shape the document. And the last point overall is argument development. So this is generally, is your essay accurate? Does it follow your 3 subtopics? And it's complex, it has a counter argument. Now, the one thing I want to take note is the counter argument. I feel like this is the part where students get most tripped up, is because they feel like they have to refute the counter argument. You do not. Each 3 of your body paragraphs, the counter argument and your other 2 supporting your main argument, all 3 should be given the same amount of attention, TLC, evidence as each other. Giving more time and evidence to prove your counterargument does not hurt you, it helps you, because that's what they want. You're proving that things are complex. So because you're giving evidence or whatever to your counterargument, that's beautiful. You do not need to refute it. If you can, awesome. If you have the time to go back and add that, that's fine. But if you don't, you're not going to be docked points for it. It's still just as great to leave a fully well thought out counter argument paragraph as is. All right, so the complexity confusion. So depending on what skill you identify the essay as, you're going to set up your complexity, like your whole essay, a little bit differently. So if it's the first skill, continuity and change over time. So if the prompt is asking you about did things change or stay the same more, you have to put yourself on the spectrum, figure out which way you're leaning and which way you're going to lean more. Say I'm going to say the more things changed. All right, I have to have 2 paragraphs on how they change, but at least 1 on how they stayed the same. If I'm going to lean the other way, it's vice versa. Same with compare and contrast. You guys did this with New England and Chesapeake. Are they more similar, more different? I'm going to lean towards the more different. So I have to acknowledge at least one way that they are similar before I go into my main argument. The only one that is different and is obviously the most confusing is cause and effect. Now, whenever you get a cause and effect essay, it's either going to ask for all causes or all effects. Because it's kind of crazy to do both. That'd be a very long essay. So all 3 of your body paragraphs will tend to be 3 effects, or all 3 will be causes, depending on what the prompt wants. So how you get the complexity here is more so ranking the causes or ranking the effects. You'll know this because the prompt usually says evaluate the relative causes or something like that. That means rank, even though it doesn't say that flat out, which is annoying. So how you do the complexity here is your counter argument. I don't like to use the counter argument term for this because it makes it confusing. It's more so the complexity is 1 paragraph has to have your 1 effect or 1 cause that's the most significant, and you have to prove why it's the most significant over these other 2. So a question that someone asked in our review session yesterday was, then how would I write a thesis with that? It's a good question. You can still use the although blah, blah, blah formula, but you're kind of flipping it. Your 2 not so important effects or causes that you're talking about come first. So although blank and blank were causes of the Civil War, blank is actually the most significant cause of the Civil War. And you can do that same with effects. So the last point I want to make for the complexity is, I know that there are prompts that it's very hard to identify the skill right off the bat, like the one I give you guys in your writing practice last week. Down here it says the 1950s were a decade of unbridled optimism and prosperity. Assess the validity of the statement. I can tell you straight up that even teachers would argue that that is pointing towards different skills. If you cannot figure out the skill, please do not get hung up on that. Do not waste time getting so confused about the skill. If you just take that statement as at face value, the 1950s were a decade of unbridled optimism and prosperity. Assess the validity, meaning agree or disagree. Don't worry about the skill. Just think of the statement and say, okay, if I'm putting this on a spectrum of agree, disagree, which way am I going to lean? I'm going to say, yeah, the 50s were generally pretty good. I'm going to have 2 reasons why they're pretty good, and at least 1 reason why it's bad. You know, there's a lot of racism, but you know, the economy was really great and whatever else. So if you feel like you can't figure out the skill, just think of it as that. More so on a spectrum of agree, disagree, like which way I'm going to lean. I can guarantee you'll still are very likely just to get the point. And your whole essay will still make sense and you'll still address what you need to. All right, lastly is other tips to follow. Again, you don't know if you're like the 50th essay they've written that or read that day, so anything you can do to make their lives easier is better. Underline your thesis. Always underline your vocab terms. Like really emphasize like I'm doing this. Please do not miss this. Always begin each body paragraph with a topic sentence that relates back to the prompt or the thesis. Again, the more organized and thought out your essay looks, the more merciful they are in your paper. It just gives them, it's like a psychological thing that they feel like you are more put together and you know what you're talking about. And then my last thing is always write as if the reader knows nothing about history. Again, if I'm giving this paper to your parents who have not had history, like a history class since the 80s, are you explaining yourself fully to where they would understand? So that means like defining any vocab terms that you throw in there, making sure that you're being as clear and specific, not vague, as possible. All right, so last thing I'm gonna show you is the strategies and tips for the first 10 minutes. So if you're getting your prompt, what's the first thing you're gonna do? First thing is obviously read the prompt, taking note of the time period or if it says a specific era, if it calls out any constraints. Try to identify the skill if you can. If you can't, again, don't worry, just take it at face value and put yourself, make it into a spectrum question and see which way you lean. After you read the prompt, this is something that personally I actually did on my A-Push test back in the day. I word vomited all over my paper. So as soon as I saw the prompt, before I even read the documents, I just wrote any vocab terms, anything I could think of that remind, like that just prompt reminded me of. Now you guys have a different setup where you have quote open note. Please, please, please do not rely on your notes totally for this exam. They say open note, but you only have 45 minutes. You guys wrote an entire essay in 45 minutes in my class, and so many of you guys were staying after the bell. They are banking on the fact that you will not have enough time to look up everything that you need to. That's why they shortened it. So if you want to have cheat sheets in front of you, like short cheat sheets, that's fine. But please do not rely and think that you'll be able to go back in your notes to look up everything. You won't. So that's just something like that, kind of brain dumping in the beginning, I found super helpful. Now, going through the docs, the goal is to not have to go back and look at the docs more than once because you're in a time crunch. So when you go through, again, it's harder because you don't have a hard copy in front of you. But maybe on a separate sheet of paper, write down buzzwords, underline key phrases or rewrite the key phrases in front of you, or basically write your main idea right then and there. The sentence you're gonna put when you cite, explain, and analyze in the essay, just write it right there. And then note any possible CST or relevant outside information that this document, you know, inspires or sparks in your head. Again, you cannot quote the document, so make sure that you are paraphrasing the document, but not like super closely. That's plagiarism. And then go back and write your thesis and your contextualization. So all this is basically the same thing I said before. Again, don't plagiarize the prompt, just kind of use keywords. Your thesis should be complex with your 3 specific subtopics, and make sure that it takes a stand. So an example of one that did not take a stand that I saw earlier this year was about the robber barons and captains of industry, LAQ, that you guys did a couple months ago. The bad thing would be some people could characterize these entrepreneurs as captains of industry because blah, blah, blah. And some people could characterize them as robber barons because blah, blah, blah. Okay, but which one are they more of? So you can tell they're not really leaning one way or the other. So just make sure that you are following my thesis formula because I guarantee you'll get the point if you do. And then go back and write your contextualization and following the things I gave you before. All right, so that is all kind of like the tips of how you should use these first 10 minutes. Again, in your contextualization, all of this should be leading up to the prompt. So keeping your thesis, keep your thesis in mind when you're just selecting what should be in your contextualization. It should kind of all build up onto each other, and you're kind of slowly building the story up until your thesis. The one other thing I want to show you is the document I created that it's like the simulation or planning sheet. So this is going to help you kind of break down the prompt and plan out what you're gonna do in your essay. Sorry, my dog's underneath the table. And just organizing your thoughts. So we're going to be using this actually for some classes and review sessions over the next couple weeks, so you guys will get a little bit more familiar with this document if you're choosing to do this stuff along with us, which I hope you are. But you can also use this the day of. If you want to print it out or have this on a separate tab or whatever and like type into it, that's fine. Or just kind of use this general setup. The other thing on here was, we were going to do this in class actually before all this started, but here's a little self-assessment, which means if you have time, you know, hopefully, if you have time after you are done writing your essay on the day of the test, this is almost like a checklist of things that you can go back and assess yourself. Like, did I do this? Did I do this? No, I didn't do this. Maybe I should go back and elaborate a little bit more or add this here. So just going through your things and seeing where you can, I don't know, boost your paper a little bit if you have a few minutes right at the end. So I'll put this on Canvas. I'm going to put this PowerPoint on Canvas, and hopefully you guys will find these a little bit more helpful. Again, if you want to practice any writing, you can at all times. At the end of each period in AMSCO, as well as on my AP website, there is plenty of DBQs that you can do for practice. Whether you're just going to simulate the first 10 minutes of planning or you're going to write the full-blown DBQ, please do so. If you want them to be sent to me and have me like, quote, grade it and give you feedback, I'm more than happy to do that whenever you need to. So please do not hesitate to practice with the DBQ writing and with the skills. But other than that, I think that we're all set. So email me if you guys have any questions. But yeah, I think we're all good. Bye.